Hello, my name is Dr. Vida Robertson, and I would like to welcome and thank you for participating in our annual Center for Critical Race Studies Fellow Spotlight. The CCRS Fellow Spotlight is a signature event which provides an opportunity for us to highlight the outstanding intellectual accomplishments and exemplary creative contributions of the Center's fellows and its affiliates. This year, I have the distinctive honor of recognizing Dr. Stacie DeFreitas for her groundbreaking text, African American Psychology, a Positive Psychology Perspective by Springer Publishing. Today's event, it promises to be an engaging discussion of Dr. DeFreitas' research, motivations, and insights into African American mental health. Today's Spotlight interview will be conducted by none other than Dr. Chuck Jackson. Dr. Jackson holds a doctorate in English from Rice University with a specialization in 20th century African American literature, U.S. horror films, and more recently, experimental Black and Chicanics filmmaking. Dr. Jackson is an associate professor in the Department of English, and his research on race, literature, and film have been published in some of the most prestigious academic journals in his field, including African American Review, the Black Camera, and Studies in Law and Politics. He serves as a founding faculty fellow for the Center of Critical Race Studies and regularly teaches the Introduction to Film Studies, Race, Ethnicity in U.S. Film, as well as his very popular core course entitled American Horror Stories. But without further ado, I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing you to the 2020 Spotlight Fellow, Dr. Stacie DeFreitas. Dr. Stacie DeFreitas is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Houston downtown and a founding fellow for the Center for Critical Race Studies. She presently serves now as the interim associate dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and she's been teaching at UHD since the fall of 2009 after working as a 2-year stint as a clinical assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. DeFreitas has published numerous peer-reviewed articles which primarily focus on issues of ethnicity, mental health stigma, and academic achievement. Her publications have appeared in various prominent journals, including Social Psychology of Education, the British Journal of Developmental Psychology, and the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. Dr. Stacie DeFreitas teaches many classes, including abnormal psychology, African American issues in psychology, the introduction to psychology, as well as her very popular counseling and psychotherapy. Dr. DeFreitas is being honored today for her recently published book, African American Psychology, a Positive Psychology Perspective, published by the Springer Company. So without further ado, I ask that you join me in a warm welcome of our 2020 CCRS Spotlight Fellow, Dr. Stacie DeFreitas.
Hi, Dr. DeFreitas.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. How are you?
I am just fine, thank you. How are you?
Adjusting.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky time, and I'm glad we're going to be able to have this conversation, even though it is recorded on Zoom ahead of time. But it's important to get some answers to some questions that we all have about this work in the frame of the faculty spotlight of CCRS. So I'm excited to get started, and thank you for agreeing to just sit down for the next half hour or so and give us some good answers. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started with the first question. And this is a question that you have, as the book came out, you've answered in various formats through the radio and through print media, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Can you tell us what inspired this book? I think that, even if we've heard you talk about what inspired the project, it would be good to hear it one more time. What's the inspiration? Tell us where the idea come from.
Yeah, it really was stemmed by teaching issues in African American psychology. And it was a course that I had wanted to teach so long, but it took me a while to be able to teach it at UHD. And so once I did, I was really excited and committed to teaching it. And I had this research paper in the class that was pretty much the culminating project. So they had lots of assignments that built up to this paper. And I found semester after semester, the papers were so depressing. They were from such it was just like, here are all these problems, right? Here are all the things that aren't going right. And I was like, is that what I'm teaching them? Is that the only thing they're getting out of this class? And I didn't want that to be what they were coming away with the class with. So I was like, okay, we're going to have to make some shifts. So I tried to shift a little bit with, okay, well, if you talk about a problem, then at least offer a solution.
Sure.
In your paper. And still it wasn't enough. There was still, to me, too much focus on these negative kind of issues, this deficit perspective, those types of things. And so really after thinking about it, I was like, you know what, I really need to change the text, because the books were kind of heavy with a lot of this, a lot of these problems and very little solutions and very little access to, well, how do we even get to solutions?
Right.
And I wanted to take a different perspective where I wasn't just making it seem everything was rosy and wonderful. I wanted to be realistic, but I wanted students to be able to look at African American culture and the community in a different way. I didn't want them to say, oh, well, yeah, I feel bad for them. They have all these problems. I wanted them to say, well, look at all these strengths, all these things they've overcome, in the way that they're continuing to persist and grow and develop, even with the history that we've had in this United States.
Good.
So that was really what it was. I wanted students to have a different perspective, and I thought it really needed to start with the textbook material.
That's incredible. And it's so remarkable that really it's the work in the classroom that leads to the larger project.
Mm-hmm.
And that Dr. DeFreitas, you are the scholar who made the intervention in the field. This is something for UHD to be really proud of. It's something that the Center for Critical Race Studies is really proud of. So, and that, it's connected to students in the classroom makes it even more remarkable. And it also it leads to my next question, which is about the students that you worked with to produce the knowledge that's now in textbook form. So let's see, it says in the book names 2 UHD alumni. And it's Valnisha Hines, who is the special contributor to Chapter 3. Mm-hmm. And Joshua Koto is the special contributor to Chapter 8.
Yeah.
Tell us about collaborating with Hines and Koto. What was it like for you? And can you describe afterwards, how does a UHD psychology student get lucky enough to collaborate with one of our professors?
Right. Well, when I had some special projects courses that were focusing on helping me get ideas together for the book. Right. So when I initially kind of started working with the book, I had students work with me like, okay, well, what topics do we want to cover? Let's do kind of like these wide searches and what are the most relevant and important things. And so I had students helping me with that process. And then I got closer to the point where I was actually working on the book. Some of the students that had worked on those earlier things reached back out to me and were like, Dr. D, I want to help you with the book, Valnisha was in graduate school when she reached back out to me.
Okay.
Like, hey, are you still working on that book? I really want to help you with that. And so we just started kind of working on some things. And she said, Chapter 3, I think it was the racism, right? The history of racism and oppression chapter was the most interesting to her. And so she helped with a lot of getting a lot of the data for the tables that are in that chapter, because there are some pretty significant and hefty tables in there.
Right.
Some of the actual paragraphs, like I think she wrote and composed for that as well. And then Josh actually reached out after her and also was like, hey, I want to help.
Nice.
So it was really just them taking the initiative and saying, I would like to participate in this. And I think by the time Josh had reached out, I was really done with a lot of the book. And I think the religion chapter was what was left. And I was like, hey, well, I need some stuff on Islam. Can you help me with that? And he was happy to do whatever he could to assist, you know. And we were very happy when I sent them a nice free copy of the book. And
yeah, I mean, what a reward.
yeah,
and, you know, again, the description that you provide demonstrates how, you know, our students, you know, get so much from their undergraduate education, but that the connections that form with professors are, you know, long lasting and provide further opportunities after graduation. So this is really something for both students to, of course, put on the resume or the CV, or it enhances, you know, the student who's in graduate school. I mean, that's something to really be proud of and to brag about.
I know their names printed in the book. I can't, you know, when I graduated from college, my name was in no book.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's right. It's pretty remarkable. So the next question is about writing. So you identify as a writer in the introduction, and you also directly state that you enjoy writing. Can you talk about the nitty-gritty of the writing process for our listeners? And so here, this includes, I mean, if you would, like you're a professor, there's family, there's, you know, now in the time of the pandemic, there's other educational, you know, components to being at home. So you're balancing all of these roles, and yet you're committed to your own writing. Can you describe, like, how do you get in the headspace? Did you ever, you know, did you write every day? What kind of challenges did you face? What's it like for you as a researcher and a writer and in other roles, if you could address? Thanks.
Yeah, you know, I think it is really wonderful to love writing. It makes it a lot easier to do that process, you know, to engage in that process. You know, since I was a kid, I loved writing. I would write stories and tell them to my brother when I was a kid. So this is just something that's been in me forever. But I think, you know, with this type of writing, I was so committed to making sure it was done. I had a lot of really hard things happen while I was working on this book. So in the middle of the book, or even towards the beginning of the book, my house flooded with Harvey. And so all the materials that I had read, like books and things, my notes were ruined because I didn't anticipate having, you know, 4.5 feet of water in my house. Yeah. So after, you know, kind of working through that process, you know, cleaning up the house and having to reorder books, reread things, you know, part of me was like, you know, I don't have to do this. You know, like, I don't have to write this book. There was this resistance, like, I could do something else. But then I was like, you know, but I really want this to be out there in the world. And so that was when I was like, okay, I have to make this a priority, right? And so what I would do is I would write for usually about an hour and a half after my kids went to bed. Most days during the week, just because it was hard to get it done during the day. So that hour and a half every day during the week, and usually I'd get up in the morning on Saturdays and usually write for 3 or 4 hours. I'd get up before they got up. My daughter, though, is an early riser. So usually, I mean, in my opinion, I'm definitely not naturally an early riser. So I would get up usually like 7 or so and try to write for a while. And unfortunately, she'd usually be up at like 7:30. I'd be like, no.
Yeah, but like, I mean, it sort of demonstrates that like every day the practice, right, can yield great results. You know, I mean.
Yeah. There were definitely some times towards the end where I was just cranking it out. Like, I just had to get it done. And so I was spending lots of hours. But over time, like, really that hour and a half every day kind of kept me in the mode. So it wasn't hard to get back into writing mode. I'm also a really big fan of chai tea. And I if I have to get up early in the morning and write, chai tea like puts me in writing mode.
I'm writing it down. This is important to know.
It's delicious.
Okay.
I do it with vanilla soy. That's the only way.
Okay.
At least for me. And so, go ahead. Did you have a question, Dr. Jackson?
Yeah, kind of like just kind of a follow-up question, because the book, as a complete work, is so meticulously organized. You know, I think sometimes students want to know about the process of writing, like what you're attending to here, as far as daily practice and balancing life and work and writing. But then also, does someone who writes a textbook write it in order, or were there, pieces that you worked on? There's glossary sections, and then there's discussion questions, but, in addition to the chapters. And so can you just talk a little bit about organization? And
I'm probably organized to a fault. That is kind of something I think genetic in me, and that my mother passed down to me. She is a woman of lists, and I am as well. So I started just creating these folders and just, articles. That was really how I started. Like for each chapter, created those articles, and then would read all the articles in a section, and then I would write an outline. And then I wrote outlines for every chapter, like kind of going through that process. And then I'd go and see, then I'd look at all those outlines and see, well, how does it line up? Are there things that are overlapping that I need to take out of one chapter and put into something else? Because sometimes some of the topics overlap. And
sure.
I had to figure out where were they going to fit.
Yeah.
So after that, after I felt like my outlines were very nice and pretty, I just started writing on the outline. So I'd take a copy of that outline, I'd rename that file chapter.
Good.
Before that, and then I'd start writing on the outline, just so I knew where I was going. Because sometimes some parts of the chapter were easier to write than others. So if it was 9:00 at night and I knew I wasn't that fresh, let me do an easy part. Let me do something that I know that I can progress on, and not something that's really going to take some time for me to wrap my mind around. Usually those types of things I try to do early in the morning, just because I know how I work and best ways that I can get things done. So then I did really write the chapters in order. I wanted to get the first, I think 3 or 4 chapters done, and I got a faculty developmental leave, right? So a semester off.
Good.
And that's how I worked on the proposal to send to the publisher. And so that was the semester I was doing all the heavy reading, writing those outlines, and then writing those first, it was 3 or 4 chapters that I did, so that I could send that off to the publisher in order to get a contract. And so after, getting the contract back, then the book shifted a little. They wanted some things that I hadn't originally envisioned for it, so I had to decide or really think, well, how much do I want to fight for this, So there were certain things that I said, I didn't really think about doing or want to do and chose not to do. But other things I was like, okay, I can definitely do that. Like even things like including the glossary. I hadn't even thought about that. We're doing that, the keywords. Yeah. We're like, no, we really need that. We need objectives at the beginning of each chapter. And I was like, objectives? Okay. Yeah. So I just, it was, once they kind of said what they wanted and how to make it more, I think they made it more like a textbook than I originally envisioned.
Sure.
Like, you know what? I think that's fine. I think as long as it's still accessible to people, I just didn't want it to get overwhelming. I didn't want people to be like, oh, this is too much. You have to be in college to read this. I wanted people that weren't in college who just wanted to know about the African American community to be able to read it.
Wow. Thank you so much for that breakdown. I mean, because this is an aspect of scholarly life that oftentimes we don't talk about, hearing you describe the mindset and the process and the organization, I mean, it provides a model for students who are listening and watching this interview, as well as your colleagues at the university. It's very inspiring to hear you be able to acknowledge that there is a process that you went through and how you were able to develop this entire work. And the negotiation with the publisher is interesting as well. I didn't realize that. It's kind of fascinating. So let's get to the subject matter. And so this question is long, but I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing.
Okay.
So the question reads, the book incorporates an impressive range of subjects in order to make its argument about the critical value of positive psychology for African Americans. This includes not only the often overlooked history of African American psychology, but also the history of racism and oppression in the US, and as well, the importance of African American work and educational cultures, hip hop, religious and spiritual traditions, and public health and personal wellness, among other subjects. This is all in the textbook. Which of the chapters did you enjoy writing the most? And why? And if you can pick one, and then if you would maybe reflect a little bit on which one was the most challenging for you, and then talk a little bit about that. Right.
I think when picking the one that was my favorite to write, it is really hard. I think it would have to be between the work and academic achievement and the hip hop chapter. Like it would have to be somewhere between the two of them, but it would be for different reasons. So like the work and academic achievement is kind of like more about what I've been doing, since I went into graduate school. Like I've been very invested in looking at academic achievement. I'm really interested in how African Americans are able to thrive, right, and do really well academically, particularly when they have a lot of challenges in there. And so that I think was the most enjoyable because it was the easiest. It was the one I was like, okay, I know this stuff. I don't even really have to look back at my notes as much to write this section. So really, I think it was just easy. It flowed, and I had to keep like trying to cut things out because I wanted to include basically everything I knew in there. And I was like, okay, this can't be 3 times as long as all the other chapters. Like it's going to be very obvious. And then the hip hop chapter, I think, was really fun to me because I love hip hop. And I think that it's an important part of African American culture, but it gets a really bad rap, if pun intended, right?
Yeah, excellent.
So, I think the issue with it is that people see one side of hip hop and think that's what it is. And it's more just, a certain type of music. Like hip hop is very broad in terms of what it sounds like, what people, how they present. Hip hop culture is even expanding, I think, in ways that people don't understand. And so I really wanted to include it and let people know that there are some very positive uses of hip hop in the African American culture that are being overlooked. Like we really need to use it more. And so I think that was why I really enjoyed that, because I was like, that's something that's hidden that people aren't really talking about as much as I think they should. I've never seen a textbook that talks or focuses in on hip hop like that. So I was excited to do that.
It's genius. I mean, that bringing together the cultural value of hip hop with, an argument for this positivist model is, I mean, that's the stroke of genius. I mean, I think all it is, but I just, that's your innovation.
Well, I'm not the first. I'm not the first.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, to see those, but like, I really liked focusing on its use, like in therapy, like people are using it in therapy, people are using it in teaching, as a form of activism, right? There's so many like really important positive ways that it's being used. So I was like, okay, we'll highlight these. Because at first I was like, well, I could work those into those chapters, but I was like, nah, we'll just have a whole hip hop chapter. That'll be more fun.
Yeah.
And then as far as the one that was hardest to write, that's easy. It was the one on racism and oppression. And I think it's just because it's hard to read through that. And you live it every day. It's not like you don't realize it, but when you immerse yourself in the literature, it gets heavy.
Yeah.
And it is hard to reflect on the history, and then it's hard to look at the present and say, we have not come as far as we should have, in this area. And so I felt like it had to be included, but it was really hard to do. And I had lots of times as I was working through that chapter where I spent lots of times talking with my husband who went to UHD and got a history degree. So he's, he knows all of these things and has immersed himself in the literature. So we just kind of bounced these things back and forth and talked about it. And that was important for me to be able to kind of not just hold it in. But also he told me about things that I ended up looking up and including in the chapter. I was like, I didn't even know that happened.
Nice.
So it was useful and important to have a historian in the house to assist with that.
I was going to ask about, as someone who gets, and as we ask our students to do often, to immerse ourselves in the study of what can be troubling content, like what's the way to relieve yourself of that feeling that might attend those studies. And you provided the answer, which is that have a good interlocutor, and to be able to share with somebody who understands the subject matter well enough to be able to just process and move forward. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Doesn't hurt that he's an historian as well. Dr. DeFreitas, we are really curious on the heels of this marvelous publication. If you could tell us what's on the horizon for you as far as research and publication goes. And we recognize, of course, that, that sometimes what comes after a book might take a different shape. So what's on your mind, and what does the UHD community and the world at large have to look forward to?
Right. Well, I am working on a book with as a co-editor with some other Center for Critical Race Studies faculty. So that's one of the things that we've been working on after the Reflecting Black conference that we had last year. We were really inspired by a lot of the submissions, and we're like, this would be a great edited book. So we kind of worked on moving into that, and hopefully this fall we'll get that wrapped up and sent to the publisher. So that'll be nice. Over the summer, I worked on a chapter looking at mental health stigma and Latinx populations. It was really a chapter overview of looking at, well, what do we know about mental health stigma? Where are the problems? That's another kind of important area of research that I've engaged in, looking at views of therapy and of just having a mental health disorder. And research suggests that people of color are less likely to go to therapy, and some of it is because of the stigma. So I've kind of gotten into that area in terms of research. This semester, I am working with some students on a project. It's an experiment that I actually started a few years ago with another UHD faculty member, Dr. Melissa Raimundo. And we did an experiment trying to look at whether students would interpret feedback from someone differently if that person was of their own ethnicity or of a different ethnicity, right? Would they accept that feedback in the same way? Would they be willing to revise their writing? How would they feel about the person? We kind of we did an experiment. So I'm in the process of kind of looking through that data and trying to figure out if it matters.
Wow, interesting. That's so those are three plates that are spinning at the same time. You've got your collaboration with the fellows in the Center for Critical Race Studies. Mm-hmm. You have your own independent work that you've worked on with the chapter on Latinx psychology, and then this third project that involves another colleague from the department and students as well, Experiment, which is exciting to me to hear about.
Well, that's why I needed the other colleagues. Social psychologists are all in on experiments, and I was like, clinical psychologists, they do experiments, but usually for medication, in therapy comparison.
Right. Nice. So is there anything else you'd like for our listeners to know about the book, or that you'd like to add to the conversation before we say thank you?
I would just say that, before I wrote the book, it seemed almost like an impossibility. I was like, is it possible for me to have a book on Amazon? It just sounded like, it just didn't sound like something that could be done. And I'm really glad that I pushed and didn't ever give up, because there were several times when I felt like, no, it's not going to happen. Or I thought, well, you know what, I'm just going to let this publisher go and I'm going to find someone else, or something, just because I had to ask for extended time, like a couple of times, just because of things that happened, with house flooding. And then also my father died in the middle of me writing the book. So there were several things, like big things. I was like, I don't know if I can get this done.
Yeah.
So what I would say to people is, don't doubt yourself, persist, push yourself. If there's something that you really want to achieve, then you just have to go in with the mindset that, yes, you're going to do it, and figure out the steps to get it done. And if it takes longer than you expected, it doesn't matter. It still happens. The time was going to pass anyway. Right. And so you'd rather have something good when the time was up, instead of looking back and saying, I really wish I would have done that.
Thank you so much for that reflection on how you were able to meet challenges and move forward with this critically important book, and for reflecting on what's possible. Dr. Stacie DeFreitas, Associate Professor of Psychology at UHD. Her book is African American Psychology, a positive psychology perspective. It is out now from Springer Publishing, and you can find it on Amazon for purchase. Dr. DeFreitas, thank you so much for your time and for your words of wisdom.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun. I'm glad you had me.